Hello and welcome back to the Family Beacon podcast from Minnesota Family Council. I'm Moses Bradford here with Grace Evans, and we are here to bring you the facts so that you can stand for truth. On this week's episode, Grace will be talking about a recent leaked video where a prominent surgeon who performs so-called gender affirmation surgery admitted on tape that these surgeries can have devastating complications. We've talked about this before, but now we're hearing it straight from the mouths of these so-called experts who perform these mutilating surgeries. Then that's some light material for you guys. And then we'll also be talking about developments in national politics that have occurred for former President Trump and for President Biden since we've been off the air during our winter break. What's been going on? What do you need to know? We'll talk about that. Finally, we'll talk about the Minnesota Party caucuses coming up on Tuesday, February 27th. What do you need to know? Where do you need to be?
All right, you guys, so great to be back on the podcast this week. And just as a reminder, we release new episodes every single week, every single Friday. So make sure you tune in. Make sure you subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. And if you're listening on another platform, make sure you follow us so that you are notified every single time we release an episode. Now, I do want to give you a warning before we jump right into our first story that the content we're going to be discussing is very heavy, is a bit graphic, and so just in case you're listening with children, we are going to be talking about some things that will include some of the details about gender surgery. Without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. I'm so glad Moses broke down what we'll be discussing. Like he mentioned in the intro, there is a prominent surgeon who performs trans surgeries that has admitted that complications of genital surgery can be, quote, pretty bad. So honestly, when I saw this headline, you guys, it kind of reminded me of when videos were unearthed of Planned Parenthood aiding and abetting sex traffickers on some tapes. It kind of reminded me of that. Like, you kind of get that same icky feeling when you see something like this, because both unearthed videos confirmed something insidious about each of the movements that we already knew, but just further confirmed it, and we were hearing it from their mouths. So the content from the video that we're going to be talking about today confirms what we've been saying all along about gender surgeries. They're extremely dangerous for everyone involved, especially for children. So first of all, I kind of want to address, where did we get this video? How do we get this video of a renowned surgeon who performs these surgeries admitting these ghastly things? Where did we get that? So we actually got that from the Daily Caller News Foundation, and we will have that article linked below for you guys to check out in full detail, because I won't go into every single thing that article covers. But they obtained a video presentation that this surgeon presented at an event that was sponsored by the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. Now that's known as WPATH. But Daily Caller got that video through a public records request. So second of all, you guys might be asking, who exactly is this surgeon that you're referencing, Grace? Well, the surgeon is Dr. Alex Linguini, and I hope I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, but he's a Canadian surgeon.
I'm gonna go out on a limb, and I'm gonna guess that it's Longani.
Perfect. Thank you, Moses.
Not that it
he's
matters.
A Canadian
I'm
surgeon.
sorry.
No, thank you. I appreciate any help here. But he's held leadership positions at the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. That's not surprising, of course. And he describes himself as, quote, an active member and a fierce advocate of trans rights. He's also part of the teaching faculty at Mayo Clinic here in Minnesota, the Mayo Clinic course on, quote, principles of care of the transgender and intersex patients. So all in all, I hope you guys can see that this is a prominent surgeon who performs these, whatever we want to call them, gender mutilation surgeries. And this presentation that we have obtained footage from was entitled Foundations in Surgery, which was part of an educational series that was recorded in 2022 for licensed clinicians seeking certification in transgender, quote unquote, care. So Not only did this surgeon, this renowned, again, surgeon, state that the complications from surgery that aim at removing male genitalia and creating female genitalia can be pretty bad, but he also noted that there are a growing number of programs throughout the world of gender affirmation that have both a lack of training and a lack of proper training. So there's this renowned person going up there and saying, we actually don't have a lot of training on this for the people that are performing these life-altering procedures on patients. Now, that's really concerning, but I really want to get into what are these complications exactly? And I'm not going to go into every single detail again, just because it's very graphic, but I will give you guys a basic overview, and you can read more in the article below. So, this surgeon has said that the very most dreaded complication that can arise from performing these procedures is the perforation of the rectum. So, that sounds so awful. Won't go into any more details on that complication especially, but that is the most dreaded complication that can arise. And the surgeon goes on to say that there's literally no space there. He said, quote, "So you have to create a new space in a spot that doesn't exist." So my automatic thoughts when he says that are, that makes sense, that makes sense that there's no space there and you have to create new space in a spot that doesn't exist. That makes sense because what these surgeons are trying to do is to create something that goes directly against God's design. So it makes sense that biological men don't have space for female genitalia. That just makes sense. That's just how the world works. And it's really sad because they're continuing to go and do these things, even though they're admitting these things just don't exist in male biology. They just don't. And so then the surgeon also goes on to explain that some more complications. One of the other main complications that can arise from performing these types of surgeries is the fact that there's always not enough skin to go around to work with in these procedures. Again, that makes sense. So extra tissue has to be borrowed from different places in the body. So the most common places, again, this is going to be kind of a little bit graphic, but the most common places that these surgeons have to borrow tissue from are from the abdomen, from the scrotum, or from the colon. And all of these places, if you're borrowing skin from, have varying degrees of risk and complication associated with them. I won't go into detail, but I know that you as a listener can just imagine the complications. And so during this presentation that the surgeon gave, he also noted the rate of wound dehiscence, which that's a fancy medical term, but basically what that means is it means it's a complication in which a surgical incision reopens after it's been closed. So of course, there's a lot of these surgical incisions going on in a procedure like this. There's a lot of moving parts and pieces. But the surgeon highlights that this specific complication of this wound reopening is as high as 75%. And that's crazy to me that people are subjecting themselves to these sort of procedures when there's a complication as high as 75% that these wounds, these surgical incisions can reopen. That's crazy. That truly is crazy. Now, because this type of surgery is so dangerous, the surgeon also goes on to admit that even if you did this type of surgery pretty often, you, quote, couldn't consider yourself proficient. He said, you're going to have more complications, end quote. Wow. Right out of the mouth of the professional who is teaching other surgeons how to do these things. So that's a lot of information. I kind of want to give a few of my takeaways from all of this. And Moses, I really want to hear your thoughts too. But something I want you guys to keep in mind is that this type of procedure is extremely, extremely costly. They average at about $45,000 per procedure. So I want you guys to ask yourself, who's benefiting here? Well, it majorly benefits the medical industry, big time. And in some states, these kinds of procedures are covered under insurance. And so the hospital, the clinic is getting so much money from these procedures. The second takeaway is that these procedures, as we can see, are extremely unsafe. There are high risks involved with this. And also, this surgeon has admitted that some surgeons have not received adequate training on these so-called sex reassignment surgeries. They just haven't. One other thing is that the people that are undergoing these procedures are not undergoing mere surgeries.
Right.
They're being experimented on. There's not a lot of data that's showing exactly the outcome. People's bodies are react completely differently sometimes. Some people are going to have complications in a certain area and others will have complications in another area. So there's not a lot of data because this is very new, right? So these people are being experimented on and their bodies are being mutilated. So it's not just a normal surgical procedure, because normal surgical procedures are designed to help someone thrive in their body rather than chopping them up. So that's something I just wanted to say too. But more than that, we know that there are all these health complications, but even if there were zero health complications for genital deconstruction or gender mutilation, as I would call it, it would still be wrong, right? Even if there weren't all of these problems with your health, it would still be wrong.
Right.
So something I keep coming back to as I'm looking at all these stats, I'm reading all about this, which is really ghastly stuff. I just keep coming back to the conclusion that in our culture today, many people want to have the power of God and they want to have control, ultimate control over who they are and how they present themselves. Now, in their mind, they're probably not thinking, I want to be God, but they want to have that kind of power that God does have. And as we've seen with the gender movement, this leads to devastating effects when people want to do that. And ultimately, we're never as good at being God as we think we're going to be, and God is always best at being God. That's what I keep coming back to as I'm looking at this. Moses, do you have thoughts on this?
I think the last point you made, Grace, is absolutely crucial. We are, we're taking these as you related these techniques, these surgical techniques. I'm thinking of
Mm-hmm.
how, previous to the transgender insanity really taking off, I was familiar with some of these surgical techniques, the idea of skin grafts, for example,
Mm-hmm.
because they are extremely helpful in cases where someone, like, for example, has severe burns, skin being taken from
Right.
one part of your body and to be put on the burned part of your body, and that's technology. That's technology. I'm not sure if that's the right word. A technique that's advanced really amazingly, so that burn victims are able to kind of live a normal life. And I imagine that sometimes that includes burns to the genital area, right? So, like, there might be legitimate times when this type of reconstructive surgery to the genital area is needed, when someone has had horrific injuries from burns or some type of accident and so forth. And so we should be really grateful that surgeons are able to provide care when people are grievously injured. But as you've made the point, Grace, that is not what's going on here. We're talking about people who have healthy bodies. They do
Mm-hmm.
not need invasive surgical care to live a normal life. In fact, this invasive surgical care lowers rather than raises their chances of having a normal life, normal reproductive function, etc., because of the risk of complications that you've just mentioned. Just one complication that you mentioned, the chance of the wound reopening, is as high as
Mm-hmm.
75% in these cases, as you said. Just to repeat that, as high as
Mm-hmm.
75% complication rate. And that's just one of the complications that you have discussed. And this is something that people, as you say, are undergoing. They're undergoing voluntarily, in a sense, but
Mm-hmm.
also there's under so much pressure. As you and I have discussed many times, when we're talking about young people, generally my understanding is, if you're going to have this type of surgery, quote unquote bottom surgery, genital surgery, and you're identifying as transgender, this is not often performed on minors. It is sometimes performed on minors, but if it's performed on young adults, it is performed on people who have grown up and who probably have, for several years, been under the insidious influence of the online community of transgender activists and mental health professionals and clinicians in the real world, right? Who are telling them this surgery will make you happy. And so they are willing to undergo horrific surgeries and experience, after that point, horrific quality of life, which this video lays out in graphic detail that, frankly, I had never seen, Grace, in terms of how high and how
Mm-hmm.
grievous these rates of complication are. So these young adults have been told for, in most cases, years, that they will experience better quality of life. And then when that is actually not the case, I just it just makes me shudder. It just like,
Mhm.
it's playing God, but it's also, it's like the individual person. I see them mostly as the victim. Like, yes, they're trying to control their bodies in a way that is playing God in a sense, but I really put most of the blame for this at the foot of these surgeons and
Mm.
psychologists, mental health professionals, sometimes even parents, and most the most virulent place this comes from is the online trans activist community, who are
Mhm.
pushing young people to do this. They are taking advantage of vulnerable young people, and they are the ones, in my view, who are playing God. More even than
Mhm.
the person who's going through that surgery, who's decided to do that. And I think it's frankly disgusting that that lawmakers are not willing to take action to stop this. Obviously, some of them are, but there's a culture war on this issue, Grace, as you know, that's so strong in this country that there are probably as grievous as these side effects are and as common as they are. There are very few, for example, there are very few Democratic legislators anywhere in the country who would be willing to publicly stand up and say, this is wrong. This is barbarous. And until that sort of ceases to be the case, until we can get some sort of consensus among among health professionals, among surgeons, among lawmakers, that this is unacceptable, we won't be able to move forward. And Grace, I think you brought it back to, this is a theological issue. It's a moral issue, and I think that's
Mhm.
absolutely right. And nothing is going to change unless God changes hearts and gives people the wisdom to see what this is, to see that this is not making someone the way they were created to be, but actually
Mhm.
ripping away their created nature as man or woman, and substituting a simulacrum that is never going to be, in most cases, is never going to be in any way effective, and in some cases is going to be a lifelong open wound on their bodies, right? Like, just to be really
Mhm.
specific and really just name that. So those are my thoughts on that. I'm really grateful that you shared this story, because as graphic as it is, and you did not even go into the most graphic details, I felt. So
Mhm.
if people want to see that, go to the link in the description to the Daily Caller. You can watch that video, and the surgeon is not holding back. He's talking to a group of
Mhm.
other clinicians. He's talking in, medical speak, and he's not trying to soft pedal the complications, because he's telling these potential surgeons, or these people who currently do these surgeries, um, even if you consider yourself proficient, you're going to have more complications. That's what he says. That's verbatim, right? So
Mhm.
I,
Mhm.
I do recommend, and I'm sure Grace would also recommend, that if you have the stomach for it, that you watch this video for yourself, and see if you think that this is something that should be done, or if this is something that we should move heaven and earth to try to stop this from happening, because that's the position I'm in.
Yeah. The truth will set you free. I will say that. So be armed with the facts so that you know the truth and you can stand up against what is evil. And I think ultimately, Moses, I'm glad that you highlighted again that this is a theological at its root. This is about theology. It's about how you view the world, and it's about how we view humans. Do we view humans with specific limitations, or can humans do whatever they could possibly want? Do we have the power to do anything in this world? Or do we have moral laws that are imposed on us for our own good and for the good of others? And so we have laws for a reason. They are a moral guide. And I think that we ultimately we need laws here to guide the people, to show them what is right, what is moral, what is not. And these types of mutilation of the body, not moral. So we need laws that show people that they are immoral. One thing too I wanted to bring up, Moses, when you're talking about how there are legislators who are scared to stand up for what is right on this. There are also, on the other side, legislators that are so willing to
That's
stand
right.
up for this kind of mutilation. So I automatically, whenever I'm thinking in having a discussion about this specifically, I think of our Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan, who last year said with regard to gender mutilation at a press conference at our Capitol, she said, "quote Our children tell us who they are, it is, and our job as grown-ups is to listen and to believe them." And every time I hear that played in my head, I just shudder. I could not disagree more when it comes to gender mutilation. Because as parents, we would never believe our child if our child said, "I'm a turtle." And we would never, even more so, we would never aid them in physically adding a turtle shell to their backs through invasive mutilation if they said they were a turtle. And so, how much more insidious is it to agree with a child who is confused about their body that they were born in, and they think they were born in the wrong body? How much more insidious is it to tell that child that they should undergo the knife to be, quote, made whole? I think about that probably on the daily. It is heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. And so as parents, we need to rise up, and we need to speak the truth to our children about what it means to be human, what limitations God has placed upon us, and how we live joyfully in light of that. And what a joy it is that we aren't God, truly. What a joy that is. It is a huge burden lifted off of us that we are not the author of the universe. One final thing on this that I've also been mulling about in my brain is just that proponents of this type of mutilation should consider this. If genitals don't define gender, then how does removing them affirm it? I don't know. That's something that I think people should be considering in their brains. It logically does not make sense. So we've hit theology, we've hit logic, we've hit the literal health impacts, we've hit what God's law says. We've hit a lot in this brief segment of the podcast. There's a lot more that could be said on this. Moses and I are going to probably talk about this again and again on the podcast, this type of thing, because it's so pervasive in our culture. But have conversations about this, be thinking about this, this kind of ideology. It's no one's safe from it. Your kids are not safe from it. So make sure you're training them up and teaching them how to think about the world.
That's absolutely right. That's a crucial thing. And I will stop talking about this because we do need to move on. But I think
Mm-hmm.
what Grace just said is extremely crucial. Train your children. If you give
Mm-hmm.
them the tools, if you are praying for them every day, and if you're giving them the tools to separate truth from lies, then they will not be susceptible to this particular scheme of the world. So I think that's such a great thing to say. I wanted to switch gears and talk a little bit about a tragedy that happened in Minnesota this past week. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time
Mm-hmm.
on this because this is something that I think all of us now are familiar with, and we've heard about this and we're praying about it. But we just want to extend our condolences to the families of 3 first responders, 2 policemen, and a paramedic who were killed responding to a domestic incident in Burnsville, Minnesota on Sunday. The It's a horrific situation. This was the
Mm-hmm.
person who committed this crime was a felon, should not have had legal access to guns. Um, I think we just our hearts break for the families of these law enforcement officers and first responders who were killed, just absolutely just gunned down in cold blood. One of them we know was a University of Northwestern grad, and several of them, I think all of them, leave behind young families. So that is just horrifying. I think we
Mm-hmm.
also uh, should give thanks that the 7 children that were in the home at the time that this happened were not harmed, and that
Absolutely.
is a blessing that came out from this after the shooter turned the gun on himself. So people are hurting in this community, especially law enforcement families. I think I saw a statistic that 9 police and first responders have been killed in the last year in Minnesota and in western Wisconsin, and that's just too
Mm.
many. And I think that is specifically not in like traffic incidents and things, but specifically in violent confrontations. So I think there's probably Another time, perhaps we can talk about what we can do to support law enforcement and their families in the extremely difficult work that they do, and how can we make that safer for them, and how thankful we are that there are people in our communities who are willing to go into harm's way to protect us and to protect our freedoms. So continue praying with us about those families and the whole community in Burnsville. Now, I wanted to talk about some things that have happened in national news, specifically political news, since we took our winter break in mid-December. There are specifically case developments in a few legal cases involving both President Biden and former President Trump that are going to be very valid. Some of these you will have heard of. I think a couple of them you may not be as familiar with, and yet I think all of them are important. So I'll share some of these, and Grace, get your reaction on this. This is extremely important because as even as majorities of Americans say that both President Biden and President Trump are too old. They're just way too old, according to people polled by various polls. Say Americans think both Trump and Biden, who are the oldest candidates ever to run for office. They were the oldest candidates to ever run for president in 2020, and now they're just 4 years older, right? So this is crazy, and yet, of course, we're going to probably have one of them, because these legal issues come as both President Trump, former President Trump, and President Biden have moved closer to securing the nominations in their respective parties. We talked about Representative Dean Phillips of Minnesota, who's challenging Biden, and he has not been able to gain traction in the Democratic race, and he will probably drop out soon. He doesn't have very long. I think it's Super Tuesday, maybe as early as March 5th. I'm not certain on the date. And by that point, President Biden will have locked in so many delegates that unless he literally dies, God forbid, or is incapacitated before the Democratic convention, he will be the nominee. On the Republican side, also, President Trump's only remaining challenger, at least major challenger, is Nikki Haley, former governor of South Carolina. I've talked to a lot of people who like Nikki Haley, but I haven't talked to anyone who really thinks she can win at this point. And in fact, she's seems set to lose her home state of South Carolina by possibly up to 50 percentage points to Donald Trump. So yeah, Trump's very strong in South Carolina. So they like Nikki Haley, but they love Donald Trump. And in fact, Nikki Haley was in Minnesota yesterday for a rally, but I didn't hear anything about it. I don't think it made a lot of waves, and I don't think that Nikki Haley is likely to win, even in the Minnesota primary, where if we go look back to 2016, Marco Rubio came first in Minnesota, followed by Ted Cruz, with Trump in third. So that's what Minnesotans showed, that they did not love Trump at that time. We'll see how that goes in 2024. So Trump and Biden are likely to be the people we have on our ballot in November. That means it's extremely crucial to talk about what's going on with legal battles, and there are legal battles involving both of them. People sometimes think that all these legal battles are involving Trump, but actually that's not true. So I'm going to talk about 4 different cases that are pending with regards to Donald Trump, and one with regards to President Biden. So President Trump has been has lots of. I'll just quickly run through the court cases against Donald Trump. There is a federal case against him regarding his quote unquote efforts to retain power after the 2020 election and the January 26th, 2021 attack on the Capitol. Charges have been filed against him, but we don't have a trial date for that. The election case in Georgia, that is, I'll discuss that more in a moment, relating to efforts to reverse Trump's 2020 election loss in Georgia. Charges have been filed there. Classified documents. He has a trial date in this regarding his handling of classified documents, and I think that trial was initially scheduled for May, but it is not likely to actually begin until after the November election, which would be pretty crazy. Well, it'd be crazy if it started beforehand. And then there's actually even more. The two developments that since we've been off the air, in the defamation case against Trump for remarks that he made about E. Jean Carroll. So this is a case. This is very sorted. Okay, and I'm not going to stand here and claim that I know what actually went on. E. Jean Carroll is I think, a gossip columnist and author. She states that Donald Trump raped her in the 1990s, and that is so long ago that it's the statute of limitations means that there's no possibility of a criminal charges against Donald Trump, and so there's only civil proceedings against him. And so I'm reading from CNN, January 26th, 2024. A jury said that Donald Trump should pay $83.3 million in damages Friday, an eye-popping sum that marks the sharpest legal setback for a former president. Well, it was the sharpest at that point. It hasn't. Now that we're here in mid-February, it's not the sharpest legal setback for the former president, now entangled in multiple criminal and civil cases. The verdict was the second time over the past year that a jury has awarded E. Jean Carroll millions of dollars in damages from Trump for his purportedly defamatory statements disparaging her and denying her rape allegations. So this is my understanding is this is not exactly a conviction. It isn't a conviction of rape. It's not a criminal conviction of rape. But it's there's it's a civil case, and so Trump is not going to go to prison, but there are financial penalties that have been levied against him. Of course, he has immediately appealed this verdict that, if he didn't appeal, would cost him $83 million for making supposedly defamatory statements. So that's one case. Now, the biggest news in Trump's legal cases since we've been off air, remaining from AP News, February 22nd, which is actually today as we're filming this. Donald Trump could be at risk of losing some of his prized properties if he can't pay his staggering New York civil fraud penalty. With interest, he owes the state nearly $454 million, the amount going up $87,000 each day until he pays. New York Attorney General Letitia James told ABC News this week that she will seek to seize some of the former president's assets if he's unable to cover the bill from Judge Arthur Engoron's February 16th ruling. Engoron concluded that Trump lied for years about his wealth as he built the real estate empire that vaulted him to stardom and the White House. Trump denies wrongdoing and has vowed to appeal. So lots of political machinations here. Of course, the Attorney General in New York is a Democrat. She has been going through huge amounts of there's just so much going on, and many people think that all of the cases against President Trump are politically motivated, and there is good reason to believe that some of them are. So those are the bad news. Those two verdicts against Trump, which he has vowed to appeal, that's the bad news for Donald Trump. However, the last few months, or just in the last few weeks, we've seen good news for Donald Trump in some of his cases. Some of the cases against him. Now, the Georgia election interference case, and there's a recording of President Trump talking to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger and saying, "Find 12,000 votes," or words to that effect, where he seems to be asking the Secretary of State after the election in 2020 to find more votes and and turn the narrow election loss in Georgia into a narrow election win. Now, those are cases. That case is brought in Fulton County, Georgia, where Atlanta is. The Fulton County District Attorney Fannie Willis has made a name for herself by prosecuting this case against Trump. But now it's clear, and I'm reading from The Hill, dated to 2024. This much we know: Fulton County District Attorney Fannie Willis had an undisclosed sexual relationship with her subordinate Nathan Wade, paying him $728,000 in taxpayer money, and received at least $13,000 worth of meals and vacations in return. At the hearing for the motion to disqualify her from continuing in Georgia's Trump persecution, Willis defended herself by saying that she paid Wade back, but always in cash and always withdrawn from a stash in her home rather than from an ATM, so there are no transaction records. I'm continuing to read from this nonpartisan publication. This is not good. But what's worse is how the Fulton County DA's office conducted Willis's defense. At the hearing, it came out that, you know what, I don't think I need to keep reading. More sordid stuff, but this time not regarding President Trump, but regarding someone who could be seen as one of the biggest threats to him, because the Georgia case continues to seem so damaging, but now with the main prosecutor behind that case likely to be either removed from office or have other penalties against her, it does seem unlikely that this case will go to trial before the November election. So that is really good news for President Trump, and good news for people who believe that that case is politically motivated. Probably the best news for President Trump legally in the last few weeks is that the Supreme Court heard oral arguments on, I believe, February 8th. In a case called Trump v. Anderson, the blockbuster case. I'm reading from slate.com. The blockbuster case contesting the former president's constitutional ability to run for office. Here comes the good news, though. A clear majority of justices expressed overwhelming skepticism towards the plaintiff's claim that Trump is disqualified under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment because he, quote, engaged in insurrection, unquote. The only real question is what rationale the court will use to reject that theory, et cetera, et cetera. So we talked about this before the break, the possibility that Trump would be removed from the ballot in several blue or bluish states, including Minnesota, because of the legal cases against him. And I don't know, though, including there was, I think, a conservative, or a so-called conservative law professor at the University of St. Thomas here in St. Paul, who stated that that actually seemed like a relatively strong legal argument. However, it has never been used. That amendment has never been used to bar. No, that's not true. I think maybe it has been used previously, but I don't think it's ever been used to bar a candidate from appearing on the ballot who wasn't actually in prison. The socialist candidate Eugene V. Debs, history lesson, was barred from the ballot, but he was in prison at the time. So that was like 100 years ago. So now, that was a long summary, guys, and I apologize, but I wanted to give you guys a sense of what's been going on with President Trump's legal battles. I will also take one more minute to talk about President Biden's legal struggles. There was a special counsel report. This was released February 6th, I think, around about that time. And I'm reading from AP News. It found evidence that President Biden had willfully retained and shared highly classified information when he was a private citizen, including about military and foreign policy in Afghanistan, but the special counsel's report concluded that criminal charges were not warranted. The report from special counsel Robert Hur resolves a criminal investigation, but its bitingly critical assessment of his handling of sensitive government records and unflattering characterizations of his memory will spark fresh questions about his competency and age that cut at voters' most deep-seated concerns about his candidacy for re-election. In remarks at the White House Thursday evening, Biden denied that he improperly shared classified information. He blamed it on his staff. I watched the news conference. It was not a good look. And he angrily lashed out at the special counsel for questioning his mental acuity, particularly his recollection of the timing of his late son Beau's death from cancer. So it was so absolutely just dark. The report said that one reason not to bring charges against Biden is that Biden would likely present himself to a jury as a well-meaning elderly man with lapses in memory and mental acuity. So in other words, the special counsel said if Biden were on trial, he would present himself as someone who has a poor memory and therefore is not criminally liable for mishandling these documents. But that's a really bad look if you are holding the most important job in the world, that of president of the United States. So, of course, and this was a bad move for Biden. He immediately, at the night that that report was released, he went out in front of the press. He was angry. He was flustered. He was more or less swearing at the press. Especially, he was especially angered by the assertions about his memory, his mental acuity, and that he had forgotten the day that his son died. Now, subsequently, it became clear that it was President Biden himself who raised the subject of his son's death in the deposition. At least it appears like that. And that he was able to remember the day that his son died, but not the year. So I don't know if that makes a difference, Grace, but that is what he said. So in other words, to sum up here, President Trump has a lot of legal difficulties. It is unprecedented for a candidate for office to have been indicted 4 times, at least 2 federal indictments, and one in New York and one in Georgia, and then and not even counting the civil rape trial. So lots of legal difficulties. It's his campaign is losing cash right now, and he has this $450 million penalty regarding his the conviction for tax fraud, the most recent one, and that will only go up by $87,000 per day until he pays that money or appeals that case. Wow, right? But at the same time, many Americans, not even just Republicans, Grace, believe that these cases are politically motivated, and moreover, it's sort of diminishing returns. Like if there was one criminal charge against Donald Trump, people might pay attention. But there are so many criminal charges against Trump, most Americans have ceased to care, ceased to pay attention. They're not able to keep these cases straight. And frankly, Republicans are willing to give him a pass, partly because, probably mostly because they think that he didn't do anything wrong and that these things are politically motivated. People on the left would love to exploit these cases for their political gain, but they're hampered in doing that because President Biden is under investigation for at least one of the same crimes that President Trump is, that is mishandling classified documents, and also the corruption case regarding Hunter Biden, which continues to, I didn't even get to talk about that, in which Biden may or may not be implicated. Okay. So in other words, it's just a race to the bottom. Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and I'm not saying they're guilty or innocent, but in the public opinion, it almost doesn't matter whether they're guilty or innocent because they're perceived as both being tarnished, and yet they're the only 2 choices we're likely to have, other than like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on the ballot. So that was so long. I apologize, but Grace, you've been following these cases too. What's your reaction to this stuff, and do you think that voters really care at this point?
I mean, I don't know. It's hard to say. That I agree with you that there's a lot of info overload. I'm feeling it. Even you're tracking these cases a lot more closely than I am, which is why I'm so glad that you broke them all down for our audience. I will say I feel like I don't know enough information about each of these cases to even speak super clearly on my opinion on each of them. And I think that's probably how a lot of Minnesotans and just Americans in general feel, that
Yeah.
there's so much to keep track of, like you said. I think that people care, but I think they don't know what things to pay attention to and what things not to pay attention to. That's definitely how I feel. I feel like I care about this, and I feel that I pray for our legal system. I just pray for justice. I pray for wisdom for our leaders that are making these decisions and really diving into all of these details. I think that's what I always come back to is we just need to pray for guidance and wisdom for our leaders that are looking at all the documents, are looking at all of the tapes, are looking at every little thing. But there really is no way for the average American to know every detail about every single charge. I think it's really important that we know that these things are going on, and to be praying. But yeah, I think they care, but I think that there's so much information that no one can be an expert. That's kind of my opinion at this point.
Absolutely right. And yeah, I think that's it in a nutshell, and we can move on from that now.
Mhm.
Grace, do you want to tell us more about our annual dinner and the developments with that in the past week?
Mhm. So we're very, very excited for our annual dinner because we are having Seth Dillon, who is the CEO of Babylon Bee, as our keynote speaker. And our event is called Rulers Rage, God Laughs. And you guys know that a lot of stuff is happening in Minnesota. A lot of stuff happened last year in Minnesota that you and I just don't agree with. It goes against God's design on many different levels. So that's why we came up with that theme. The rulers are raging against God, and God laughs. And ultimately, we can rejoice because we're on God's side and we know how the story ends. Now, speaking of recent developments, we're really excited because a lot of people are pumped A, about our speaker, Seth Dillon, but B, about our theme, which is pretty awesome and very unique. And so, that being said, we are on track to sell out, and we have 4 times as many people registered as we speak than we normally do at this point. And we just opened registration last Friday. So registration hasn't even been open for a week at the time of filming, and we're on track to sell out. So if you want to get your ticket, if you want to join us on April 26th with Seth Dillon for an awesome night, make sure you head over to mfc.org /dinner 2024 and get your ticket now, because I don't want you guys to miss out. I want to meet you there, and we're so thrilled. So get your ticket now. Moses, before we close, can you tell us about caucuses that are coming up on Tuesday?
Yes. Caucuses are coming up on Tuesday, Grace.
Yeah, thank you.
Folks, if you have not caucused before, it's really easy. Go to caucusfinder.sos.state.mn.us. You will need to enter your zip code, and if you live in the Twin Cities or a denser area, you'll probably enter your house number and street. Then you will find out exactly where the Republican caucus is and where the Democratic caucus is, and those are Tuesday the 27th at 7 p.m. sharp. Be there or be square. Pick a party. Go find, and it won't give you social anxiety. It is just fun. You'll sit at a table with folks, and guess what? They're your neighbors. And you know what? You're going to agree with them about most things politically. And I found that to be an extremely fun evening. There'll be discussions of resolutions, what direction your party should go in, discussions of candidates who should be endorsed, and so forth. And of course, there's the chance that there could be differences of opinion. But it's just a fun thing. I think I think everyone, I think everyone in Minnesota should go to these caucuses, and it's our duty as citizens. This is the smallest grouping, right? It's the start of the political process of this election year.
Mm-hmm.
This is the first event on the calendar in terms of leading up to the November elections, and I'm just gonna go out there and say it's fun. So do it. And if you're in St. Paul, I will see you at the GOP caucus at the Capitol Hill Magnet School on Concordia Avenue. Now, double check though, because there are several GOP caucuses in St. Paul actually. Okay, so Grace, this is a longer episode, so I think we'll save what we're reading until next week.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you can remember what you read this week and tell me next week. But
Sounds good.
Can you take us out, Grace, as we always do each episode, with some words from the Bible, God's word?
Absolutely. So I really wanted to read to you Psalm 29:10, which reads, "The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord sits enthroned as king forever. May the Lord give strength to his people. May the Lord bless his people with peace." And I just think that's a timely verse for us today, talking about some pretty hard stuff, especially there at the beginning, very, very dark. It's encouraging to me to always remember that God is enthroned above all of this craziness that is flooding around us. He is enthroned, and he is forever our king. And just saying that in that psalm, it says, may the Lord give us strength. May he give his people strength. And that is truly my prayer every day, that he will give us strength as we go out in the world and we speak truth. We speak God's truth. My prayer is that we will have the strength to be unafraid to speak up when we need to. And ultimately, too, that psalm ends with asking the Lord to give us peace. And I think that's a great prayer for us today. So next week, you guys, we're hoping to have Renee Carlson of True North Legal on the podcast. So we're very excited for that opportunity, and we will see you next week.